I did want to say, so Anabel Hernández is in residence here at Berkeley at what we call the Investigative Reporting Program, which is part of the Graduate School of Journalism. We have offices at 2481 Hearst, and Steve Fisher is a fellow there as well. So they're a little team working out of Berkeley and part of an ongoing program that we have organized over the last decade. And part of it is focused and is continue to focus on Latin America and particularly on Mexico.
So we're going to begin with these three presentations, and then we will have time for questions and comments. We'd ask people to keep their questions brief so we can have as much discussion as possible. And please join me in welcoming our two guests in person and Anabel Hernández.
Hello, I am Anabel Hernández. I'm a Mexican investigative journalist. For me, it's an honor to be invited by Professor Shaken to be here. I'm so sorry I have to be in Culiacan, Sinaloa this week, but for me it's an honor to be here to try to explain the case Iguala, the attack and disappearance of the students that happened on September 26, 2014. First, I wish to explain why this case is very important, not just for the Mexican society, also for the United States society. And I really want to talk about that. My colleague Steve Fisher, that is with me in this investigation, will explain another points of our investigation that have been supported by the Investigative Reporting Program. The case Iguala is very important because it's one point that break in the story of Mexico, and I'm sure that it will be an before and after after the case. As you know, on September 26th, more than 100 students from teachers' school Ayotzinapa were attacked on that night in the middle of downtown Iguala. And some of them, 43, were disappeared that night. As you know, this teacher school is very important in the recent story of Mexico, because this school has been always related with protests against the injustice of the government, not just now, in the past. So these students that were attacked and disappeared that night in Iguala are part of one group that is really uncomfortable for the federal government. We noticed that 12 of the 43 students that disappeared that night were part of the really very important structure of the government of the school. So that wasn't an accident what happened that night. These students, 10 of them, will be in the head of the school in this last February if they did not disappear that night. As you know, the U.S. government has been support the Mexican government through the Plan Mérida by many years ago, since 2008. The U.S. government has been giving to the federal government millions of dollars trying to combat the drug cartels. This money has been supporting the structure of the Mexican Army, Marines, and the federal police. With this money, you have been buying equipment, you have been paying the training of these members, you have been paying the training of the members of these institutions. But now we know that members of this institution are directly related with the case of the students. My colleague Steve will explain point by point, but I can tell you that we have proofs, not just documents, also videos that shows that the federal police was in the attack against the students that night on September 26th. And also the army was part of the old operation of that night. Even the head of the army in Mexico told that no one was in Ayotzinapa that night. We have documents that proves and testimonies that proves that members of the army were working that night in the city. Also, we have documents, federal documents that shows that the army, the federal police, and the Marines have been involved in torture against the people that are accused to be members of Guerreros Unidos, and suppose this cartel were part of the attack and disappearance of that students. And we have documents that prove that these people have been tortured before give their testimonies and accuse to themselves that they did it. So as you can see, indirectly, you are paying for these people that just not just are involved in several crimes in Mexico, also are involved in this terrible case in Iguala. We have documents from the government of Guerrero, one report of more than 900 pages. We also have information, we have access to all the criminal file, to all the case that the Attorney General Office has against Guerreros Unidos, against Abarca, and also all the investigation that they have been doing about related with the case. Also, we have testimonies from the students and also from the people that was that night in Iguala. Thanks again for inviting me, and I'm sure I will see you soon.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here, and I'd like to thank Carly and the Center for Latin American Studies for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be able to present the findings of this investigation to you all. So you got a pretty good overview from Anabel on what's happening, but I wanted to step back just briefly, and for those of you who may not be as familiar with the official version of coming from the government on this story, I'd like to lay that out point by point first. The government of Mexico had been saying and continues to say for now the past 5 months that the students were coming from the school in Ayotzinapa, the rural teachers' school. They were coming to Iguala to essentially disrupt an event that the mayor and his wife were putting on. It was an event of about 4,000 people. They said that the students came, spread mayhem, and he was upset. Well, in fact, he was very concerned that they were going to do more damage than they had already done when they arrived at the city, and so he demanded that his local police, the municipal police, do away with these students, and demanded in conjunction with the cartel Guerreros Unidos. According to the government, the students were, the local municipal police took the students, brought them to the municipal base within Iguala, and from there, other municipal police from the nearby town of Cocula helped bring these students to a landfill in Cocula, where they were supposedly gruesomely piled up and burnt. And then their bodies were, the ashes, or what was left of them, was put in bags and thrown into the river nearby. According to the government, the military and the federal police, whose bases are about no more than 5 minutes away from, you could say, ground zero. The military did not know, they said, for 2 hours after the attack. So we're talking about 2 a.m. that morning, the next morning of September 27th. And that the federal police had no involvement and they were not aware of the attack either. Here's where our investigation comes in. First of all, I think it's important to start with the federal police and what we found in their involvement in this attack. We have documents and information that shows that individuals at the school, the Ayotzinapa school campus, called in the numbers of 2 buses that were headed out. And that was at 6 p.m. that night on September 26th. And they called into a central command center in a nearby town called Chilpancingo. Federal police are present at the command center, so are municipal police, so is state police, and so is an agent from the military. That was the first the federal police were aware of the students coming to Iguala. The federal police then intercepted the students on the highway en route, and this is from the 900-page document that Anabel referenced, the Guerrero State report. They arrived, they intercepted the students, but there was no altercation. They arrived in the city, they followed the students throughout, and then from depositions that we have in Guerrero State, in the Guerrero State investigation, it shows that the federal police, in fact, fired on the students. That's according to depositions, that they fired on the students that night. We have eyewitness testimony that say that the federal police blocked off the back, because bear in mind, these students were coming out of town with 5 buses. 3 of them had gone the wrong way, and those were the ones that were blocked off in one particular street just before the highway. The federal police blocked the back, the municipal police blocked the front. The military, what we found was that, in fact, the military was aware of the attack the entire time, contrary to what the commander-in-chief said to the Mexican Senate, saying prior to our investigation that the military, as I mentioned earlier, was not aware of the attack until 2 a.m. And as a result of what is called a C4, this command center, they were aware of the attack throughout. Another article eventually came out where the military gave interviews and said, yes, they were aware of this throughout. But they negate the fact that they would have were involved in any aspect of the attack, only that they knew what was happening that night. Another very important point regarding the military is we have a source who was at the municipal base that night, the police base in Iguala, and said that a commander came in with 8 details, armed agents, and they searched the entire base. The cells, the restrooms, the entire municipal base. And that was not reported. That was not something that was documented at all. So that's what we know to this point about the military. The key witnesses that were supposedly Guerreros Unidos cartel members, important members according to the Mexican government, including one who was more or less the treasurer, who was paying off, he said in his deposition, was paying off the mayor and paying off the municipal police, and others who were key roles, essentially became the foundation of the investigation, the Attorney General's investigation into this case. At least 5 of them we found were brutally tortured prior to deposition, prior to giving testimony. Their testimonies were varied. It was difficult to, I mean, there was, they contradicted each other in many ways, but of course, when you're looking at a testimony given under torture, it's essentially nullified in international law and in Mexican law. They had electric shocks in a number of different parts of their body. They had bruises and beatings and what appeared to be very systematic torture. That was essentially our first article. When that article came out, the Attorney General of Mexico, Jesus Murillo Caram, came out on to speak to Carmen Aristegui on CNN Español, and he said Well, she asked him, of course, about our article, and he said, from his understanding, the federal police were not involved that night in the attack. He said because he read an article in La Jornada, which is a popular newspaper in Mexico. They had interviewed a federal police general, and the general said that they weren't involved. And he said that to him tells involved. Regarding our reports about torture, he said he didn't. He was not aware of the torture, and he asked that we would please bring him the documents. These are the Attorney General's documents to show him the torture. The Mexican magazine, where we've been primarily publishing our articles, Proceso, in Mexico, sent him a reply and said, Anabel and I helped with this reply, but it officially came from the magazine, and they laid out point by point the criminal case file numbers, so that they could go and locate absolutely every medical examination that we had access to show this type of torture. There were also complaints lodged with the Human Rights Commission of Mexico regarding this torture. So this was in addition to reporting it was prior to reporting we'd already done. Our second article focused primarily on the torture of municipal police. So we're talking about scores of municipal police, including police from Cocula and police from Iguala. And in that article, it was especially powerful because the municipal police were being held in a military base prior to them being brought to give their depositions or their testimonies at the headquarters of the Attorney General. Before they left that base, the military had the forethought to do medical examinations of them. And those medical examinations we've seen them and they were clean. There appeared to be no lesions, there appeared to be no beatings. The next medical examination, which is of course required prior to their depositions, at the headquarters of the Attorney General showed extreme beatings, torture, and similar things to what we saw with the situation with the supposed Guerrero Unidos cartel. And I'm sorry, I know I'm running through a number of points here, but I'm happy to answer questions as well in the Q&A. But I wanted to mention, finally, our last article was a rather polemic article in that we showed the contradictions in the investigation, in the criminal investigation into the mayor, Jose Luis Abarca. He is essentially the kingpin or the pinnacle of this case in terms of, supposedly leading Guerreros Unidos and being in charge of this entire disaster of having disappeared these students and having facilitated them being burned. We found extraordinary contradictions within his case. We found that the Mexican government has 3 versions of how he was detained in 3 unique places. One was the one that came out on Televisa, which is in Ixtalapa, as a house there. Another, he was supposedly detained, he and his wife were supposedly detained at a federal police checkpoint. And another right outside the Attorney General's headquarters. And it's very important to note that we found no direct charges against the mayor related to the disappearance of the students and the sort of essentially ordering the municipal police to do what they did.
You mean no direct charges? You mean there are no charges on file against him?
There are no charges related to the disappearance of the 43 students and him. He is not placed on the scene of the event at any point. What he is charged with is gross and systematic violations of individual rights, conduct that disrupts public order and peace, and repeated failure to fulfill his obligations. And that's the case with Jose Luis Abarca, and to this point, we will continue our investigation, and we have so much more to dig into. We've only just begun. But I think, and it's important, this case is especially important in this time with the new the party, and I think it's important to see, to understand the context in which something like this could happen, and what I've just explained to you, some of the contradictions, and how this would be information would be able to be held in secret, while a different version is presented to the public for such a long time, considering the extraordinary media scrutiny on this case. And I'll leave it to you all to talk a little bit about the history of...
The history of Mexico.
Well, how this is possible.
Well,
I'm sorry, I did fail to one thing. I did want to present just briefly the cell phone video.
why don't you explain where this came from and,
Yes.
and how, and before you show it.
So what I'm about to show you is cell phone video footage taken by the students that night, and it had never been seen before. The representatives of the students gave us this footage, and it's important to note that at a certain point they talk about the presence of the federal police on that street at the time that they were there. Anything else?
Well, you can fill it in as we watch, because it's...
Sure. I won't show it all because it's a little lengthy, but I just want to give you a sense of it.
¡Márquenle! ¡Ya le marcaron! ¡Márquenle, buscale! ¡Tú! ¡Márquenle los vatos, venga! ¡Venga, saldo, venga! ¡Dale que tenga saldo, pues! A ver, ¿cómo? ¡Ya mataron a uno! ¡Ya mataron a uno! ¿Qué que tengo aquí? Oye, ¿tú vas a tomarle foto de otro? Número, ¿qué número? De la marca. 154, 108, 20, 16. ¡Ábrete! ¡Ya mataron uno! ¡Háblale a la ambulancia! ¡Háblale a la ambulancia! Hay que subirlo en este bus. Avísenle a las 30 si el número que se están llegando todo el tipo de madre. ¿Dónde? Ya le están yendo, policías. Van a quedar los federales, van a querer ¿qué disparan? ¿Qué fue? ¡Ya recoge los castillos, cabrón! ¡Dale lo que hiciste, verdad, mierda! ¿Por qué los andas buscando? ¡Pinche perro, los de huevos! Bueno. ¿Quién es el vato, güey? Bueno, necesitamos una ambulancia aquí a Rodrigo Herrera. Hay un compañero que le falta la respiración. ¡No recoge los castillos! ¿Por qué lo recoge, hijo de tu puta madre? ¿Sabes lo que hiciste, maldito perro? Necesitamos...
Small example of what happened that night, and obviously how disconcerting the situation was.
Well, you say, in Mexico, you know, first of all, I should say that I did say before, you know, we at the Investigative Reporting Program, we try to do stories which no one else is doing. And so that's why we recruited Anabel after she appeared at one of our symposium gatherings a year ago in April, right?
Yeah.
And because she was then living with bodyguards and with her 2 children, and basically was tired of living that way. So she's relocated here and recruited Steve, or they bonded at the symposium, and have been doing this work since then. But I think those of you who know Mexico know that violent death, assassination, journalists, usually Mexico every year is about the top in terms of the number of journalists who've been killed or injured or assaulted. So all this is, in a sense, become a way of life. I think the most startling thing to me always about Mexico is that we think of it in the United States, and the media thinks of it either only when either there's some drug war or drug spillover of the drug war into the United States, or the immigration issue, and that there are all these relatively poor Mexicans coming into the U.S. One of the things I got involved in back in the mid-90s was investigating the regime of Carlos Salinas, his family, and their various friends, and the oligarchs. And you know that Mexico has more billionaires than any other country in Latin America. There's great wealth in Mexico. Most of it is here. They keep it here. But that big contradiction when we talk about inequality and income in the United States is obvious in Mexico itself. And from what I understand from people who live there, who I've been talking with, old friends, there's something new that's happening, and that's why this case is so important. The new thing that's happening is that it's palpable on the street now that people do not feel safe and do not feel that the government actually is a place that they can turn to. So seems to be a growing sense of unrest in Mexico that's it's not manifest in a great movement yet on the streets, but amongst people talking about what's going on. That there's always been a difficulty in having confidence in what's happening. I was showing Harley earlier that the stories I did 18 years ago about the Salinas family and their friends and their wealth, as was at a time when Raul Salinas, the brother of Carlos Salinas, was arrested for helping to being involved in the assassination of his brother-in-law, who was the head of the PRI, and that he was also involved as an executive in Conasupo, an agricultural ministry in Mexico, because he had appropriated $30 million in cash, and it was part of monies that he was attempting to move out of the country. Raul today, his brother Carlos, who was in exile in Ireland and elsewhere right after he was president, is back in Mexico, is recognized as being one of the most powerful people behind the president of Mexico. And that Raul is now out of prison, and I don't know if you can see this, it was sent to me, but a judge in Mexico, after he got out of prison, has decided that the $30 million actually was his after all, because the president at the time had given it to him. So the money was returned to him, and he was recently seen in his first public appearance showing off his brand new gull-wing BMW. So I only put that for the context of this kind of event going on in Mexico, and then the fact also that while there's a lot of media attention, the media attention doesn't seem to be reconciling, for instance, these documents, which primarily come from the defense, right? I mean, you can't tell us the source, but these are discovery documents that are part of the criminal investigations.
The 900-page Guerrero State report, which is one of the most important reports that we have in our possession, is actually publicly available. People have not found it online.
It's on the web.
It is.
So you can also see that the media, while it may not be looking at what's hiding in plain sight. And I think on the U.S. side, the difficulty is that the media doesn't really care. And that's just the reality. I'm always ending with a downer.
Well, I'd like to ask two clarifying questions, and then we'll open it up from questions from everyone. The two clarifying questions are, you mentioned that the federal police were directly involved in detaining the 3 buses that went in the wrong direction. Am I correct on that?
Right. They essentially created a blockade from the back, keeping the buses from possibly backing up. And then, the municipal police were in the front. So right. And we also have witnesses who say that there was a block. So on the side street, going off of the street where the 3 buses were, there was another federal police detail blocking there. So essentially blocking off 2 sides and the municipal police the other.
And the other clarifying question is, how extensive was the coverage of this? We know it was very extensive with social media and in other more limited areas. How extensive was the coverage on the major television networks?
Well, thanks to Lowell, we were able to get this story on NBC Nightly News. In Mexico, Carmen Aristegui, who's a very well-respected journalist, did a half-an-hour panel with Denise Desser, who's just here, and also a number of others just speaking about the report, our first report. And then since then, Carmen Aristegui has continued to report on our stories. In terms of English language coverage, we got it in a number. I mean, Telesur did it in English language. Democracy Now! Did an interview. And then in terms of CNN Español did something, and of course they were the ones on which Carmen Aristegui interviewed the Attorney General about our article. But there's a broad number of outlets that have covered it since we started.
Yes.
Yeah, a couple of very quick questions. First of all, something you mentioned, something like 43 students were killed out of 100-some. What happened to the others and how did they survive, first of all? Second of all, has the pre-president been pinned down to respond to questions about the mayor and the federales? And finally, and my Mexican friends and those of us who work in Mexico, we've all had to pay at least more details. Corruption is such a way of life. Do you have any notion of any political figures who genuinely would like to root it out? Because we've gone from the pre to the pun, and the disaster of Cardenas on the left in Mexico City. Are there is there any political order that wants to really make change?
So to your first question, the students, we don't know if they're dead. They've been disappeared. There is an assumption that they may have been burned to death, but we don't actually know. Certainly, Anabel and I are not aware of their status at the moment. The rest of the students, a number of them fled, a number of them ran, a number of them were along the sides of roads just hiding for hours and hours and hours. Another huge number of them hid in a clinic, which is where the military found them that night during the events of the attack. And at this point, parents pulled a huge number of the students out of the Ayotzinapa school for fear that there would be reprisals. So a lot of them have returned to their rural communities. The president, to my knowledge, certainly publicly, has not been asked about these allegations. I think he's left that to his attorney general, from what we understand. He just resigned this week. Last week, a few days ago. As far as the figures who can create actual change, I don't know. I think I have two extraordinary experts to my right who are much better at talking about broader issues in Mexico than myself.
Lowell, do you have anything you want to say in relation to that? Yes.
Can you elaborate or make the connection between Salinas de Gortari then and Salinas de Gortari now and the Peña Nieto relationship? I mean, like, what's the difference or the similarities of the violence that was going on back in when Salinas was in power and now?
I think there's more violence now, or at least from people I've spoken with. There's more of a sense of general insecurity, as opposed to, let's say, some narco violence here. Or remember when the Archbishop was killed, and in various other incidents that took place in Mexico. But now people weren't talking about it. At least in Mexico City, they weren't talking about it in the same way they are now, that they don't feel safe on the street, they don't know whether to go to the government, they don't know what's going on. And I think that that's the question, at what point does Mexico start to fall apart? And I think that that's really a major concern to the U.S. government right now.
Yes.
My good question on Anabel's brief presentation. She clearly pointed at us to be kind of collaborating on this assassination through our tax money. What is the lead on this? I mean, she was very clear saying the Merida program supports the funding to train, to support, to arm, etc., etc., etc. What's the lead on all this chain of logic that she's mentioning there? I have a lot of respect for her, and I think I would like to see that. It's very important.
Well, I assume that what she's talking about is that, so she's not here to explain it, but I assume that she's saying that the Merida Accords resulted in equipment and various kinds, mostly military and police equipment, becoming available to the Mexican federal police and the armed forces in the drug war that's being used now against the people. That's what she was implying. I couldn't go any further in terms of like explaining it. I do have I guess I don't look in that direction often, but an example of how difficult things have become in Mexico. You may remember that around the time that President Obama was going to visit about Merida, there was a seizure of $200 million in a house in Mexico City. Made big news. It was the largest cash seizure in the history of the drug war. I mean, of actual $100 bills. Pictures of it. Big mound of money inside the house. And one of our previous fellows, Monica Cruz Rosas, who's now in Mexico City, her project was to find the money. And it's disappeared. And the person whose money it allegedly was, who was known as El Chino, Eugene Ligon, a Mexican Chinese naturalized Mexican, a Chinese citizen who was naturalized Mexican, who was involved in the pharmaceutical business and allegedly was moving methamphetamine precursor chemicals from China through Argentina into Mexico. He was actually apprehended in the United States. He's still in the United States. He has not been extradited yet back to Mexico. In a long proceeding, it's now 7 years proceedings, and a very mysterious case. And he was indicted in the United States, and then all charges were thrown out in the U.S. So it's not even clear he's going to be prosecuted. So it's that kind of mysterious disorganization, I think that's really the key difference right now. The United States has always, to some extent, provided some kind of military assistance, especially anti-drug or assistance to the Mexican authorities. But I think what's different right now is the kind of, I don't know how to describe it, other than to say a lack of confidence on almost all levels in terms of authority in Mexico.
Yes, yes.
On that note, after the students disappeared, there was a tremendous outpouring in Mexico City several times, huge demonstrations in the street and also all over the country. Has that popular reaction dissipated now? I mean, is the government playing like a war of attrition, like if they just wait it out long enough, they're hoping that people will just go home and hide in their houses?
Well, you know this government guy is better than I do.
The crisis has really resonated in a very deep way. I think the initial response of the government, perhaps a horrible act, let's move on, that simply hasn't happened. There have been larger massacres in recent times, the 72 Central American migrants, for example. But there's something about the fact that this was a teacher's college, these were students, surely with a radical past, but it represented hope for poor people. And there was something about all these things going together that has really caused a collapse that the government is now aware of and is saying directly that there is this collapse of confidence and that the confidence itself has to be rebuilt. The government says that.
Right, and the president and his wife and their houses and where the money came from, all that started coming out at the same time. So you have, you know, a real question about what is the effectiveness of the government and who are they working for, and you know, there are very simple things in Mexico, like cell phone rates, you know, which are exorbitant, right? And then it turns out basically one person owns all the cell phones. And how did that happen? He got the money, the franchise from Carlos Salinas when he was president, when they privatized. So you see that sort of cycle, and people understand that that's the way business is done and what's going on. And if you add on top of that lack of physical security for your children, for instance, that's going to create some real problems. And I think we've only seen a little bit of this so far.
I think
what's going to happen.
It's also, you know, the parents of these students are worthy of attention in the fact that they have mobilized, and they know how to mobilize, and it's clear. You know, these students were radicalized and in a very, essentially a very radical school, so it's not for nothing that they know how to rally the troops, essentially. So I think, and as Harley said, it's just touches the heart. It cuts across so many social classes, which I think is what you were alluding to as well, and yeah, it's touched a nerve.
Yes, way in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and sharing some of the truths that are happening south of this illusion of a border. This isn't really a question, but it's a call for us to consider how close in proximity we actually are in this issue. Janet Napolitano, who is former head of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, is currently the president of the UC. So I want us to, you know, think of how we can relate ourselves within this university to students in Mexico who are also experiencing a different form of oppression and suppression as we are. She's currently teaching a course on public policy at the School of Public Policy. So I guess I'm just really thinking about how we're much more implicated in this process than we really think we are, like just a few blocks away from here. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question that relates to the official story. I wanted to know if a few days back when they attempted to close the book and say, this is the official story, you know, let's move on. I'm talking about the PRI government. if they had already heard from Innsbruck and what is the information that the Argentinian experts have provided? How those
Forensic.
Yeah.
do you have access to that?
Do we have?
Do you personally, you or Anabel, and did Innsbruck provided anything?
We haven't been in communication with the Argentine forensics group. Of course, we have an extraordinary amount of respect for them, and we're supposed to have lunch with Eric Stover, which you continue to remind me. So we haven't had communication with them.
Lax.
You know, I mean, your reference to them seeking to close the case. I mean, there are a number of initiatives that I think the Peña Nieto government has that they want to push forward, including economic reform, among others. And I think they really do want to move on. And Peña Nieto came out as well, saying, it's a painful situation, but we need to move on. And I think our investigation shows that there are so many extraordinary contradictions within this criminal file that we have that it's hard to understand how one could move on before coming to some more concrete conclusions.
I have also a brief comment on that, and I'd have to preface it by saying this is far from my area of expertise, but I do know personally some of the key investigators in the Argentine forensic group. The Center for Latin American Studies has worked with some of them on issues related to Central America, Guatemala in particular. They are highly regarded and very capable. They have done a critical role in terms of the investigation, but also within the last several weeks, they issued a public rebuke to the Mexican government about the character of the official investigation that was going on based on their own work.
But they haven't been able to identify it.
They've identified one
Right.
student. One. Yes.
So there have been many people saying that it's impossible. What the Attorney General claims that the students were burned outside, it's like in the no. But I think they haven't provided any really strong evidence that that is not possible. On the other hand, there are many people who are claiming that the students were actually taken by the military and burned there. Is there any evidence with regards to that, like where the students were taken to, or any clues?
Fire, remember the helicopter?
Yeah. To answer your last question, we don't know where they are, and we don't have evidence to that effect. We're working on it. In one of our articles, we wrote about how the morning after the Guerrero state government required a helicopter surveillance flight over Iguala, and essentially you would see Cocula, which is right next to Iguala. The people on that flight were highly credible. They were accustomed to doing these types of flight. One of them had come out of the military, had a 20-year history of working in the military, really good at what they do, and they didn't notice. And the flight was going during the time that the Attorney General said that the students were burning, and they noticed, they say, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary, and that's according to the documents that we got from the Guerrero state government as well. I don't know how it is possible, or maybe they just would have ignored the tower of smoke that was there, but they say that they didn't see anything. In terms of whether they were burned in that landfill, I mean, there's UNAM is a well-known university in Mexico, and they did a study, an extraordinary study, talking about whether or not it was possible, and essentially, among many points, they said you would have needed 10 times the area, the landmass. You couldn't pile them up like a tower. They would have to be laid. I mean, it's gruesome, but they did say very directly that they don't believe it was logistically possible. And I'm, again, going off of research that UNAM did as far as what they have available.
We have time for, unfortunately, one more question. Yes.
Thank you. I want to know know a little bit more about like the journalist role, which of course is extremely important here in terms of how are you taking, you know, security conscious for yourselves, and Anabel, that I understand is there, and also if you're aware of other local journalists in Guerrero that are just, I don't know, facing censorship or self-censorship, which I imagine is the case as when you are investigating.
So we send an email to Lowell every day while we're there. We're like, all is well, morning and morning and evening. We do not take any undue risk. We're very aware, especially with the fact, as Lowell mentioned, that Anabel has been in Mexico for the past 4.5 years. When she was in Mexico over the past 4.5 years, she was never without a significant security detail. So going down there now is incredibly sensitive. We're being as careful as we can. There are other journalists in the area. In fact, there were journalists present that night during the attack. The students called in a press conference and journalists came out. They refused to talk. They have refused to go public. And it's something we've been seeking out. We've been trying to find them and trying to get them to be willing to tell us what they saw, because they must have seen quite a lot. So yes, I would say that there are journalists that are very afraid to report.
I have a brief comment before we conclude. I just want to recognize the extraordinary care, rigor, and courage that Anabel and Steve did in carrying this out, and the importance of, with all the difficulties and all the dangers of trying to bring a story to a broader public attention that materially influences how we think about the case and larger issues as well. And I'd also like to recognize the extraordinary role of the Center for Investigative Reporting.
It's actually the Investigative Reporting Program. The Center for Investigative Reporting
is different.
But he also founded that one.
Oh yeah.
That one too. The investigative, as I was saying, the Investigative Reporting Program that Lowell Bergman directs, that has done such an extraordinary role in this and other areas in providing the guidance, the resources, the vision, and the support, no matter how difficult the outcomes for journalists like Steve and like Anabel. The Center for Latin American Studies is doing a number of additional programs yet this semester, looking at various dimensions of this and current issues in Mexico. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you for coming.